Artemis II was more dangerous than Apollo 11. That sounds at first glance like an absurd thing to say, a genuinely ridiculous claim. Apollo 11 flew in 1969 with a guidance computer that had about 72 kilobytes of read-only memory and 4 kilobytes of RAM. Less storage than a single low-resolution photograph on your phone. Less processing power than the chip inside a modern greeting card that plays a 10-second jingle when you open it. And with that, it landed 2 men on the surface of an alien world with no backup plan if the descent engine didn't fire, no abort system that would work in the final seconds before touchdown, and no rescue mission waiting in orbit if something went catastrophically wrong. It came home on a heat shield that had never been tested at lunar re-entry speeds with actual human beings inside. And yet the mission that splashed down on April 10th, 2026, with all the accumulated technology of 6 decades of spaceflight behind it, with better materials and better computers and better everything, carried risks that would have made the original Apollo engineers lose sleep. Let me explain exactly why. We tend to think of danger in space as something that belonged to the past, the early days, the cowboy era, the time when astronauts climbed into tin cans strapped to modified ballistic missiles and hoped for the best because hoping was sometimes all they had. Apollo 11 was the peak of that era, the absolute pinnacle. 3 men launched on a Saturn V rocket, a machine with the explosive energy equivalent of a small nuclear weapon, and flew 250,000 miles to a place no human being had ever touched. Think about that distance for a moment. 250,000 miles. If you drove a car at highway speed without ever stopping, it would take you roughly 6 months to cover that distance. They did it in 3 days, in a vehicle the size of a large SUV. With no GPS, no internet, no possibility of a resupply mission. The moment that defined an era. Neil Armstrong had to manually fly the lunar module past a boulder field to find a safe landing spot with roughly 25 seconds of fuel remaining. 25 seconds. If you've ever been stuck in traffic and watched a light turn yellow, you understand what 25 seconds feels like. It's not long. It's barely enough time to make a decision. Armstrong made his. He found a patch of flat ground near the edge of a crater, set the Eagle down, and reported that the engines had shut off with the tanks running near empty. Mission controllers in Houston exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes. If the ascent engine on the lunar module had failed to ignite after their moonwalk, a single engine, no backup, 1 shot, Armstrong and Aldrin would have died on the surface of the moon. Not quickly, slowly, over hours, as the oxygen supply dwindled and the temperature inside the cabin swung from extreme cold to extreme heat with the turning of the lunar day. President Nixon had a eulogy ready. William Safire wrote it. It sat in a folder in the White House, waiting to be read on live television to the entire watching world. It began. Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. That's the image we carry. Apollo as the ultimate gamble, the ultimate roll of the dice. And in many ways, it was. The lunar module's walls were so thin you could punch through them with a screwdriver. Not a power tool, a regular hand screwdriver. They were made of material roughly as thick as a few layers of aluminum foil, because every ounce of weight mattered for the ascent back to orbit. Armstrong's heart rate hit 150 beats per minute during the final descent, as program alarm codes blared in the cockpit. 1202, 1202, executive overflow, the computer telling them it was running out of cycles, and mission control had seconds to decide whether to abort. The entire landing sequence relied on a single ascent engine that had never been fired on the moon before. And if it had failed after the moonwalk, there was no plan B, no rescue mission, no second lander waiting in orbit. Just a slow, inevitable death on the surface, and a speech from the president that was already written and waiting. Those risks were real. They were extraordinary. And they were accepted, consciously and fully, by three men who understood precisely what they were signing up for. The Artemis assumption. So when NASA launched Artemis II on April 1, 2026, sending Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen on a 10-day flight around the moon, the public assumption was simple and understandable. This is the safe version. 57 years of progress. Better materials, better computers, better simulation, better medicine, better everything. We've done this before. The moon is a solved problem. This should be routine. It wasn't routine. It was, in certain critical and deeply unsettling ways, a more precarious mission than what Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin flew 57 years earlier. And the reason comes down to a single component that most people never think about until it fails. A component that sits between the crew and extinction for the final minutes of every lunar mission. A component made of a substance that NASA's own engineers did not fully understand as well as they thought they did. The heat shield. The physics of fire. When a spacecraft returns from the moon, it hits Earth's atmosphere at roughly 25,000 miles per hour. Let that number settle for a second. 25,000 miles per hour. That is over 30 times the speed of sound. If you could somehow translate that speed to everyday experience, it means that in the time it takes you to read this sentence, a returning lunar capsule would travel more than 30 miles. The air in front of the capsule compresses so violently, so rapidly, that there is no time for it to simply move out of the way. Instead, it stacks up. It squeezes. It heats. The air in front of the heat shield reaches temperatures above 18,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That is approximately twice the temperature of the visible surface of the sun. Not twice as hot as a furnace. Not twice as hot as a volcano. Twice as hot as the surface of the nearest star. The capsule's heat shield itself reaches around 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The air turns into electrically charged plasma, the fourth state of matter, beyond solid, liquid, and gas, that wraps completely around the vehicle and cuts off all radio communication. No signals can penetrate the sheath of ionized air. No communications can reach the crew. For 6 full minutes during Artemis II's re-entry, nobody on Earth could talk to the 4 astronauts inside that capsule. Nobody could help them. Nobody could warn them. They were falling through fire alone, in silence, with only the guidance computer and the heat shield standing between them and oblivion. Every crewed lunar mission in history has faced this moment. Apollo faced it too. The difference is what each program knew, and crucially, what each program had forgotten, about the material keeping those astronauts alive. The defect that changed everything. Rewind to December 2022. Artemis I, the uncrewed test flight, splashed down in the Pacific Ocean after a successful trip around the moon. Engineers were thrilled. The Space Launch System rocket had worked. The Orion capsule had performed beautifully on its translunar trajectory. The mission was, by almost every measure, a success. Then they pulled the capsule out of the water and looked at the bottom. The heat shield was covered in pockmarks, hundreds of them. Chunks of the ablative material, a substance called avcoat, had cracked and broken away in locations that the computer models never predicted. NASA's Office of Inspector General documented more than 100 locations where the material had worn away differently than the engineers expected. 3 of 4 separation bolts embedded in the shield had melted through their thermal barriers. A thermal barrier being, in this context, the layer of material specifically designed to prevent exactly that kind of melting. The parachute cover, which might have captured physical evidence of debris impact from the flying shield fragments, was never recovered. It sank to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, taking its evidence with it. The damage didn't cause a catastrophic failure. Internal temperatures inside the crew cabin stayed in the mid-70s Fahrenheit throughout re-entry, comfortable even. If astronauts had been aboard Artemis I, they would have survived. NASA was quick to point that out. There was margin remaining. Virgin avcoat was still intact beneath the damaged layers. That distinction matters, but it also misses the larger and more troubling point. The models were wrong. The ground testing didn't predict what happened. The computer simulations didn't see it coming. The people who built the heat shield and designed the re-entry profile didn't know, going in, what their own material would do. And here's the detail that should focus your attention. The heat shield for Artemis II was already built. It was essentially identical to the one that had just come back, looking like the surface of a cratered alien world. The root cause. NASA spent nearly 2 years investigating. Teams of engineers pored over the Artemis I data, ran new tests, built new models, and argued about what had gone wrong. In December 2024, they announced a root cause. The issue centered on a property of the avcoat material called permeability, its ability to let gases escape through its structure. The word sounds technical and dry. The implications are anything but. During re-entry, avcoat is supposed to slowly burn away in a controlled process called ablation. As it heats up, the material undergoes pyrolysis, a kind of combustion without oxygen, and generates gas. Lots of gas. Hot gas under pressure. That gas needs to vent outward through the charred outer layer of the shield. If it can vent, the pressure dissipates. The outer layer stays intact. The system works as designed. If it can't vent, if the outer char layer is too dense, too sealed, too impermeable, pressure builds inside the shield. Cracks form. And when enough pressure accumulates behind a weakened point, pieces of the shield blow off into the slipstream, exposing the layers beneath to temperatures that were never supposed to reach them. On Artemis I, NASA used a technique called skip re-entry. The capsule dipped into the upper atmosphere, bounced back out like a stone skipping across a lake, and then plunged back in for final descent. This technique increases the distance the capsule can travel during re-entry, which gives mission controllers more flexibility to avoid bad weather at the splashdown site. Apollo used the same technique. Apollo's heat shields handled it fine. The problem was that the avcoat on Orion is not the same avcoat that flew on Apollo, not even close. The forgotten knowledge. The original Apollo heat shield was a single honeycomb matrix, hundreds of thousands of individually filled hexagonal cells, each one manually packed with avcoat compound. Think of a massive honeycomb, every cell filled by hand, creating a mosaic of tiny ablative tiles separated by thin walls of honeycomb structure. Those walls, those boundaries between cells, acted as microchannels, natural pathways for escaping gas. The system breathed. It had been designed, consciously or not, with built-in permeability. Orion's shield uses about 200 prefabricated avcoat blocks, large pre-manufactured panels bonded to the heat shield structure. Think of it like the difference between a mosaic made of 10,000 tiny hand-placed stones and one made of a couple hundred large prefabricated slabs. The large slabs cover more area faster. They're easier to manufacture. They're easier to inspect, but they're fundamentally different objects with fundamentally different material properties than the original. The new formulation turned out to be less permeable, less able to breathe. And during the skip phase of re-entry, when the capsule climbed back out of the atmosphere and external heating dropped temporarily, the outer char layer sealed up, cooled slightly, became less permeable. The interior was still blazing hot, still generating gas from ongoing pyrolysis, but the gas had nowhere to go. Pressure built. Cracks formed along the boundaries between avcoat blocks. And when the capsule dove back in for its second pass through the atmosphere, the weakened shield started shedding material in patterns that nobody had predicted. Apollo engineers actually knew about the permeability issue. They understood it, at least implicitly, because the structure of their design addressed it. The original honeycomb design, with its hundreds of thousands of tiny cells, naturally created pathways for gas to escape. Each cell was individually filled, and the boundaries between cells acted as microchannels. The system breathed without anyone explicitly having to design a breathing system. It was an emergent property of the manufacturing method. When those engineers retired, when the contracts ended, when the manufacturing was handed off to new companies working with new materials to build a larger capsule for a new program, that understanding didn't transfer. It existed in the heads of people who were no longer in the room. It existed in documents that weren't read or weren't written or weren't connected to the decisions being made decades later. It existed in the gap between what was known and what was transmitted. The Avcoat formula was licensed by its original developer, Textron Systems, to Lockheed Martin, who manufactured the Artemis shields under contract to NASA. And in an ironic twist that would almost be funny if human lives weren't literally at stake, the Artemis II heat shield was actually manufactured to be even less permeable than the Artemis I shield. Not more permeable, less. The reason was quality control. Engineers wanted to be able to perform more thorough ultrasonic testing during manufacturing inspections. Denser material, less permeable material, transmits ultrasonic waves more reliably, making it easier to detect internal defects. So they made the material denser so they could check it more thoroughly, and in doing so, they inadvertently made the permeability problem worse. The very act of trying to ensure quality may have increased the risk. The quality improvement measure introduced a safety vulnerability. Somewhere in the 5 decades between Apollo 17 and Artemis I, the knowledge that kept astronauts alive during re-entry was quietly forgotten. Not lost in a fire, not erased by catastrophe, quietly forgotten. Retired along with the engineers who held it, reformulated by teams working under different contracts with different specifications for different vehicles. Optimized for the wrong properties. The knowledge degraded not because anyone was careless or stupid or negligent, but because institutions don't remember the way people remember. Institutions remember what is written down, what is contractually specified, what is explicitly taught. The unwritten understanding of why a 50-year-old heat shield design breathed the way it did wasn't any of those things. The decision. NASA had 2 options when they understood the problem. Option 1, redesign the heat shield entirely, rebuild it with improved Avcoat permeability, requalify it, and fly a corrected vehicle. Timeline, at least 2 additional years of delay. Option 2, fly the existing shield, but change the re-entry trajectory to avoid the thermal conditions that caused the damage on Artemis I. They chose option 2. The modified plan shortened the skip phase. Instead of a long, graceful bounce back out of the atmosphere, followed by a second full plunge, Artemis II would make a shallower initial dip, followed by a much shorter climb before the final descent. The goal was to keep the outer char layer hot enough throughout the entire re-entry sequence, including during the brief skip, to maintain permeability. A hot char layer is a permeable char layer. A permeable char layer lets gas vent. Gas that vents doesn't build pressure. Pressure that doesn't build doesn't crack the shield. The logic was sound. But keeping the char layer hotter during the skip also meant exposing the crew and the capsule to higher sustained heating throughout re-entry. And it shrank the distance Orion could fly during the entry profile, which reduced the geographic range of possible splashdown sites, which reduced the program's ability to avoid bad weather at the targeted landing zone. They didn't eliminate the trade-offs. They shifted them. They traded one safety margin, the heat load on the crew, for another safety margin, the structural integrity of the shield. They traded weather flexibility for thermal control. They traded the redesigned hardware for a modified procedure. Engineers tested this approach in ArcJet facilities at NASA's Ames Research Center, applying high heat flows to small samples of avcoat and verifying that the modified thermal profile maintained permeability. An independent review panel agreed with the analysis. NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman reviewed the data in January 2026 and gave the go-ahead. Not everyone was convinced. The Cassandra. Charles Camarda is a former NASA astronaut and heat shield expert who flew on the first shuttle mission after the Columbia disaster. A mission that carried an almost unbearable weight of institutional trauma. A program flying again after killing 7 people through exactly the kind of organizational overconfidence that Camarda understood viscerally. He attended meetings at NASA headquarters in January 2026 to review the Artemis II data. He walked away unconvinced. His concern wasn't that Artemis II would necessarily fail. He acknowledged, when pressed, that he thought the mission would probably come home safely. What terrified him was the reasoning process. The same computer models that failed to predict the Artemis I damage were being used to certify the Artemis II fix. NASA had worked backward from the Artemis I flight data to reproduce the cracking behavior in laboratory conditions. They had demonstrated that they could recreate the problem, but they had no validated forward predictive model that could reliably forecast how the full-size shield, with its full-size avcoat blocks, its full-size joint boundaries, its full-scale thermal gradients, would behave under conditions it had never actually experienced. There is a crucial difference between a model that can reproduce what already happened and a model that can predict what will happen next. A model that only works backward is not a model. It's a description. Commander Reed Wiseman saw it differently. He sat through the engineering reviews. He examined the data with the experts. He asked hard questions and received what he judged to be satisfactory answers. In his words, if anyone who was about to board the rocket had sat in those meetings, listened to the engineers, and gone through the data, they would have had the same comfort he did. That's worth something. That matters. Astronauts are not passive passengers. They are technically sophisticated professionals who engage deeply with the engineering of their missions. But it's also worth noting that astronauts are, by nature and by selection, people who run toward risk. That is what they do. That is who they are. The question worth asking is not whether the astronauts were comfortable. The question is whether the institution behind them was managing the risk or rationalizing it. Camarda saw a pattern he recognized, a pattern with a name, a pattern with a body count. Columbia's ghost. In 2003, a piece of foam insulation broke off the external tank during launch and struck the left wing of the Space Shuttle Columbia, punching a hole in the thermal protection tiles on the leading edge of the wing. Engineers at NASA noticed the foam strike on camera during the ascent phase. Some raised concerns. They asked management for satellite imagery of the wing to assess the extent of the damage. Management declined the request. The reasoning was the reasoning that kills people in aerospace. We've seen this before. Foam strikes had happened before on previous shuttle missions. The shuttle had always been fine. The damage was probably survivable, probably manageable. Columbia broke apart during re-entry on February 1, 2003. The damaged leading edge allowed superheated plasma to enter the wing structure, destroying it from inside. The vehicle disintegrated at 200,000 feet. 7 crew members, Rick Husband, William McCool, Michael Anderson, Ilan Ramon, Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, and Laurel Clark, died. Camarda watched the Artemis II heat shield debate unfold and saw echoes of that logic. The structure of the reasoning, the shape of the institutional response. We tested it. The margins look adequate. The risk is acceptable. We've flown it before, and we were fine. He issued a specific and chilling warning. A successful Artemis II flight would, in a very important sense, be the most dangerous possible outcome. Not because success is bad, but because success in this context, with this process, with these models, with this level of uncertainty, would validate a decision-making framework that he believed was fundamentally flawed. It would teach NASA, institutionally, that it could fly known defects and that the modified trajectory approach was a reliable substitute for hardware fixes. And that lesson, applied to the wrong mission under the wrong conditions in the future, could be catastrophic. Success would set a precedent. The precedent might kill people later. The Apollo comparison. Now compare this to Apollo 11 directly. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins flew with a heat shield that had been designed specifically for the exact re-entry conditions it would face. The AVCOAT formulation was the right formulation. The manufacturing was understood by the people doing the manufacturing. The permeability characteristics were accounted for in the design. When Apollo 11 hit the atmosphere at roughly 25,000 miles per hour on July 24, 1969, the shield performed as predicted. No surprises, no unexpected pockmarks, no chunks missing from locations the models didn't anticipate. The shield was not a source of uncertainty. It was a solved problem, a confirmed element in the engineering ledger. The engineers who built it understood what they had built and why it would work. The danger of Apollo 11 was in the genuinely unknown, the things that simply could not be tested in advance. Would the lunar module engines fire reliably on the surface of another world, in vacuum, in the extreme cold of the lunar night transition? Would the landing radar work in the final moments of descent? Would the surface bear the weight of the lander, or would it sink into regolith that no one had ever touched? Would Armstrong's manually flown approach to the surface succeed where an automated touchdown had nearly failed? These were unknowns, real, acknowledged, terrifying unknowns. The heat shield was one of the things they felt genuinely confident about, and they were right to feel confident. Artemis II flipped that equation completely. The mission didn't land on the moon. It didn't dock with a lunar lander. It didn't deploy any hardware on the surface. Most of the complex rendezvous and landing operations that made Apollo 11 so harrowing, the descent, the surface operations, the ascent back to orbit, the rendezvous and docking with the command module, were entirely absent from Artemis II's flight plan. Fly out, loop around, come home. The mission flew on something called a free return trajectory, meaning that even if the main engine had never fired again after the trans-lunar injection burn, the physics of orbital mechanics, the moon's gravity, would sling the capsule back toward Earth automatically. Apollo 13 flew a similar profile in April 1970 after an oxygen tank exploded in the service module, and that trajectory saved the lives of Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes. The danger of Artemis II was concentrated in those final 34 minutes on April 10th. The time between the crew module separating from the service module and splashdown in the Pacific Ocean. 13 minutes of active, committed, irrevocable re-entry where everything had to go right. The entry angle had to be precise within a narrow corridor measured in fractions of a degree. Too steep and the G-forces would be lethal, the heating catastrophic. Too shallow and the capsule would skip off the upper atmosphere into a higher orbit with no way to return. The parachutes, all 11 of them, deployed in sequence, had to open on time, in the right order, without tangling or tearing. The capsule had to survive the transition from 25,000 miles per hour to 19 miles per hour, a deceleration that subjected the crew to nearly 4 times the force of gravity, pressing them into their seats. And underneath all of that, beneath the parachutes, beneath the guidance system, beneath the trajectory calculations and the weather avoidance maneuvers, was the heat shield. The heat shield that had already failed once. The heat shield that had been certified for flight not by redesigning its fundamental properties, but by changing the conditions under which it would be asked to perform. The brake analogy. Here is an analogy that might make this clearer. Imagine you discovered that your car's brakes have a design flaw. Under normal highway driving conditions, they work fine. But during prolonged downhill driving, long mountain grades, steep extended descents, they overheat. They lose effectiveness. The last time you drove them hard downhill, they showed signs of significant stress damage. You need to take a long road trip that includes several mountain passes. What do? Option A, fix the brakes. Option B, plan a route that avoids the steepest grades and trust that the less severe downhill sections won't push the brakes past their known stress limit. NASA chose option B. The hill they were avoiding was the specific extended thermal profile of a full skip re-entry, which happened to be the trajectory designed to give mission controllers the most geographic flexibility for weather avoidance at the splashdown site. They didn't fix the brakes. They planned a route to avoid the hills, and then they drove the mountain pass. The final descent. On April 10th, the physics cooperated. At 7:33 p.m. Eastern Time, the crew module separated from the European-built service module, exposing the heat shield to open space for the first time in the mission. The crew had done their checks. The trajectory was set. The outcome was now entirely in the hands of materials, thermodynamics, and the laws of physics. 4 minutes later, Orion fired a brief 18-second trim burn to set the precise entry angle. At 7:53 p.m., still 1,956 miles from the splashdown site, the capsule hit the top of Earth's atmosphere at 400,000 feet altitude, traveling at 24,661 miles per hour, just 130 miles per hour short of the speed record set by Apollo 10's crew in May 1969, the fastest humans have ever traveled. The re-entry was fully automated. The crew rode the Fireball on autopilot, their lives in the hands of the guidance system and the avcoat beneath them. The plasma wrapped around the capsule. All communications went dark. In mission control, the families of the 4 astronauts sat in a viewing room and waited. Lead flight director Jeff Radigan admitted afterward to feeling what he called an irrational fear, the kind that is simply human nature when you know exactly what is happening and cannot do anything about it. 6 minutes later, 6 of the longest minutes in the history of human spaceflight since 1972, the capsule emerged from blackout. 2 drogue parachutes deployed, slowing Orion to about 300 miles per hour. Then 3 pilot chutes. Then 3 enormous main parachutes, each large enough to cover a football field, billowing open in sequence and bringing the capsule down to about 19 miles per hour. At 8:07 p.m. Eastern Time, Orion hit the water off the coast of San Diego. Mission Control called it a perfect bullseye. Commander Wiseman radioed that all 4 crew members were doing well. Within 2 hours, recovery teams had them out of the capsule, onto a raft, and lifted by helicopter to the USS John P. Murtha. The heat shield held. What the engineers will find, but how well? That question will not be fully answered until engineers disassemble the capsule and examine every square inch of the avcoat surface. Every crack, every divot, every region of unexpected ablation will be cataloged, measured, and compared to the predictions. If the modified trajectory worked as designed, if the char layer stayed permeable, if the gas vented cleanly, if the ablation pattern matches the models, it validates the operational fix. It means the engineers understood the problem well enough to solve it with a trajectory change. If the shield shows damage patterns that resemble what came back from Artemis I, unexpected pockmarks, chunks missing from locations the models didn't predict, separation bolt failures, it will raise serious and uncomfortable questions about every assumption that went into the decision to fly. There's another layer to this story that doesn't get discussed enough in the post-mission coverage. The Orion capsule is bigger than Apollo's command module. Apollo's heat shield measured about 12 feet 10 inches across the base. Orion's shield is 16.5 feet. That is a significantly larger surface area, more avcoat blocks, more joints between those blocks, more boundaries between manufactured panels, and each boundary is a potential location for the kind of pressure-driven cracking that damaged Artemis I. More opportunities for uneven ablation in locations the models didn't account for. Scaling up a thermal protection system is not a linear problem. The physics of gas permeability, thermal expansion, and pressure distribution all change with scale. What works predictably at small size doesn't automatically work predictably when you add 4 more feet of diameter and multiply the surface area by a significant factor. Apollo 11's crew faced the terror of landing on the moon with 25 seconds of fuel remaining. That terror was known, acknowledged, named, and planned around. Mission controllers knew exactly how much fuel was in the tanks. Armstrong knew exactly what he was looking for in the final seconds. The threat was real, but it was fully defined. Everyone in the loop understood it. Artemis II's crew faced the terror of re-entering Earth's atmosphere in a capsule whose thermal protection system had already failed once and had been addressed not with a hardware fix, but with a trajectory modification and a prayer that the models were right this time. That terror was known too, but not fully defined, not fully predictable, not fully trusted even by the people who approved the flight. The difference that matters. Apollo 11's danger was the kind you sign up for when you volunteer to do something no one has done before. The danger of the unknown. The danger of stepping into territory where there is no map, no precedent, no proven answer. That danger carries with it a kind of freedom. When you know you're guessing, you're honest about it. When you're honest about it, you're careful. Every Apollo engineer knew they were working at the edge of human knowledge. That honesty, that institutional humility, made them meticulous, made them question, made them test everything they could test, and acknowledge everything they couldn't. The Apollo 11 heat shield was the product of a program that questioned everything because everything needed to be questioned. Artemis II's danger was the kind that comes from institutional compromise, from the gap between what engineers at one level know and what managers at another level decide. From the erosion of tacit knowledge across 5 decades of program gaps, contract transitions, and organizational evolution. From the confidence of inheritance, the belief that you're building on a solved foundation when the foundation has actually been subtly undermined. From the pressure of schedule, of budget, of political expectation, of the desire to not be the person who stands up in a meeting and says the mission that everyone has been working toward for years is not ready to fly. Artemis II flew into something that Apollo 11 never faced. Not the completely unknown. That would almost have been easier. It flew into the partially known, the space where you have enough data to convince yourself you understand the risk, but not quite enough to actually prove it. Where the models reproduce the past failure well enough to be reassuring, but can't reliably predict the future performance well enough to be definitive. Where the engineers on the technical side have genuine concerns that the managers on the programmatic side have judged, in good faith, to be acceptable. Where the astronauts themselves have reviewed the data and feel comfortable, but where an outside expert with a specific type of experience has looked at the same data and felt a chill. The institutional lesson. Apollo's astronauts carried the weight of complete uncertainty and, paradoxically, the freedom that comes with it. Every engineer on that program knew they were making their best guess. That honesty made them careful. That acknowledged uncertainty drove the meticulous testing, the redundant systems, the endless review meetings, the culture that demanded every known risk be named and every unknown risk be hunted down. Artemis II's astronauts carried the weight of a specific, identified, unresolved problem, and the institutional assurance that it had been managed. And managed is a very different word than solved. Managed means it has been addressed to a sufficient degree that the risk is judged acceptable within programmatic constraints. Solved means it no longer exists. Apollo's engineers tended to solve problems. Artemis II managed one. 4 astronauts are home because the physics cooperated with the math, because the modified trajectory kept the char layer permeable, because the gas vented and the pressure didn't build and the avcoat held together through 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit and 3.9 Gs and 6 minutes of radio silence. That cooperation of physics and engineering is real, and it should be celebrated. They made it home. All 4 of them, healthy. Victor Glover described watching the sun disappear behind the moon in a total solar eclipse visible from Orion's windows and called it one of the greatest gifts of his life. Christina Koch peered back at Earth from 250,000 miles away and described a view that words struggle to contain. Jeremy Hansen became the first Canadian in human history to leave low Earth orbit. Reed Wiseman commanded the farthest crewed flight from Earth in human history, reaching 252,756 miles from home on April 6th and beating Apollo 13's record by more than 4,000 miles. Those are the stories that will be told, the triumph, the images of Earth suspended behind the lunar surface, the crew naming craters after their spacecraft and their loved ones, the splashdown and the cheers in mission control, and the families embracing. The footnote. The heat shield story will fade into technical footnotes. Most people will not follow the capsule disassembly analysis. Most people will not read the engineering reports comparing the Artemis II ablation pattern to the Artemis I damage documentation. Most people will remember the mission as the one that went around the moon and came home, which is true and worth celebrating. But NASA has already acknowledged that future Artemis missions will use a redesigned heat shield with improved avcoat permeability. The data from Artemis II's shield will directly determine the timeline for Artemis III, the mission designed to actually land astronauts on the lunar surface for the first time since December 1972. If the Artemis II shield performed as the modified trajectory was designed to ensure, the program moves forward on schedule. If it shows damage patterns that raise questions about the adequacy of the fix, every downstream mission gets pushed back while engineers redesign. The Artemis II heat shield will become an artifact of a transition period, a growing pain between eras of human spaceflight. But its performance, once the engineers complete their analysis, will shape the trajectory of human lunar exploration for the next decade and beyond. The lesson, the one that Charles Camarda tried to sound the alarm about, the one that echoes through the Challenger explosion and the Columbia disaster and every other moment in aerospace history where institutional momentum outran engineering certainty, is this. The most dangerous missions are not always the ones with the most dramatic objectives. Sometimes the most dangerous mission is the one where everyone agrees it will probably be fine. What Apollo and Artemis tell us. Apollo 11 flew into the unknown. Artemis II flew into something arguably worse, the partially known. The space where confidence and uncertainty are mixed in precisely the ratio needed to produce an institution that has convinced itself it understands a problem it actually only partially understands. The space where the engineers who are most worried are 1 or 2 levels removed from the decision makers who are least worried. The space where a successful flight can teach the wrong lessons and a failed flight proves the lessons that someone tried to teach before the failure. That's the comparison that should stay with you, not the raw technical risks of landing on the moon versus flying around it. Not the 25 seconds of fuel versus the 6 minutes of blackout. The comparison that matters is the comparison between 2 programs' relationships with uncertainty. One program knew it didn't know. The other program thought it knew more than it did. Apollo 11's astronauts were brave men who flew into genuine uncertainty with their eyes open, and their engineers' uncertainty explicit and acknowledged. Artemis II's astronauts were equally brave people who flew into a known defect with institutional assurance that it had been addressed, and with one of the world's foremost heat shield experts standing outside the room saying the assurance was premature. 4 astronauts are home, the heat shield held, and the fact that it worked does not mean it wasn't the more dangerous bet. It means the bet paid off. Those are not the same thing. Next time, NASA will have a better shield. Next time, the models might actually predict what the material does under the full range of conditions. Next time, the institutional knowledge about why Apollo's heat shield breathed the way it breathed will be written down, tested, verified, and transmitted to the people who need to hold it. Next time, the gap between what engineers know and what managers decide will be a little narrower. But this time, on this flight, Artemis II threaded a needle that Apollo 11 never had to thread. And the 4 people who came home from that mission deserve every celebration they receive. And so does the uncomfortable truth about the mission they flew. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are curious about the real story behind the headlines. And if you want more videos like this, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'll see you there.